All right, so let's start with the big story that we are tracking on WION at this hour. The tensions rising in eastern Ukraine. The Western powers have stepped up their diplomatic efforts to try and see if an invasion by Russia into Ukraine can be averted. What is interesting is that France has held a series of talks with all parties involved in a bid to try and de-escalate the hostilities. And the French presidency has announced that both the United States President Joe Biden and the Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin have accepted in principle to hold a summit to discuss security and strategic stability in Europe. The France has said that there is some diplomatic hope of resolving the Ukrainian crisis. Now, the LSE in a statement has clarified that the summit can only happen so long as Russia does not invade into Ukraine. Now, the summit proposed by France will be expanded to include all stakeholders and has been finalized after a series of calls by the French Premier. Now, Emmanuel Macron rang up the Russian president and held a conversation that lasted reportedly for 105 minutes, in which both leaders have agreed to work for a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine and also to intensify the diplomatic efforts. The French President Emmanuel Macron subsequently also spoke with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Following this, the Ukrainian President called for the resumption of talks with Russia under the OSCE auspices, confirming support for immediate convening of the trilateral contact grouping, which includes Ukraine, Russia and the OSCE. Ukraine has also reiterated the call to intensify the peace process and has called for an immediate ceasefire. The LSE has confirmed that Macron and Putin then had a second call on Sunday evening, which lasted for another 60-odd minutes, where they discussed the possibility of de-escalation of tensions in the region. Following this, Emmanuel Macron then parleyed with his American counterpart Joe Biden, and they discussed the ongoing diplomacy and also the deterrence efforts. The United States has now agreed to attend the Ukraine summit called by France on the condition that Russia does not invade. The French negotiations have built up some hope of a possible resolutions, but uncertainties also continue. The West continues to warn that Russia is poised to invade into Ukraine at a moment of its choice. Washington has even accused Moscow of using the pretext of a false flag operation. President Joe Biden has called this as Russia's decades-old war tactic. But on the other hand, Russia maintains that it has no plans of invading into Ukraine. All right, now to give us more details in terms of what all of this diplomacy, of course, means, we are joined in by Ross Cullen, who's joining us live from Paris. Now, good afternoon to you, Ross. This has been a day of pretty hectic parleys, where we have seen the French President Emmanuel Macron, of course, have talks with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. And according to the reports, both Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden have in principle agreed to hold a summit. Do we have any more details as to when this summit-level talks could take place?
It has been a weekend of intense diplomacy, intense telephoning by Emmanuel Macron, the French president, picking up the phone to speak to Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, on Saturday. As you say, two different phone calls with Vladimir Putin on Sunday, also speaking to Joe Biden, the US President Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor. Those two calls with Vladimir Putin came before and after he'd spoken to Western allies, and we had a conclusion of those talks with Vladimir Putin in the early hours of the morning. The French presidency sending out a note after the conclusion of those calls at 1:46 a.m. So this morning, French time, very late calls with Vladimir Putin, trying to ensure that there is a framework for a possible leaders' summit between the US President Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin, his Russian counterpart. Any potential summit, there would be the possibility for the groundwork to be laid for that summit this Thursday, the 24th of February. All eyes on a potential meeting between Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, and Sergei Lavrov, his Russian counterpart, the foreign minister level, so the Secretary of State and foreign minister trying to work out, iron out those details for their bosses, the two presidents, to potentially meet the first time since Donald Trump, the former US president, held talks with Vladimir Putin in the Finnish capital Helsinki 2018, looking for a possible resolution to this Ukrainian summit, the Ukrainian crisis at this summit. Joe Biden saying he's agreed to this summit in principle on the condition Russia does not invade Ukraine. Russia, for its part, says it has no intention of doing that, and its building up of troops is something it's just doing domestically on its own territory, with no intention of an invasion or an incursion into Ukraine. So Emmanuel Macron, the French president, really trying to shuttle diplomacy, different calls with different leaders to try to ensure that there is still a path for dialogue, because the overall situation, especially from the US side, has made it clear that they believe that Moscow is headed for an invasion of Ukraine, but France very much still trying to find a route out of this crisis via dialogue.
You know, the fact of the matter is we've been looking at the way the diplomacy has been conducted between Russia and indeed the West. In the past, there have been agreements like the Minsk agreements that state out very clearly as to what needs to be done for peace to prevail. But all of these agreements have been violated. What we've witnessed in the Donbas region is that there's been heavy shelling that's been reported. So what hope is there that diplomacy can succeed this time round?
Yes, you're right that there has been this ongoing war in eastern Ukraine, separate from the current crisis, since 2014, with the Russian-backed areas of eastern Ukraine where there are a majority of Russian language speakers, and the potential for a Russian incursion into that part of Ukraine. There's the consideration by Moscow of potentially recognising those two self-proclaimed people's republics in the east of Ukraine, in the Donbas region, the Luhansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic. Moscow potentially recognising those two republics. That's something that is not even possible for Ukraine to consider. They are, as far as Kiev sees it, integral parts of its territory, and Ukraine's territorial integrity and Ukraine's sovereignty has been something that we've heard a lot of in Western summits, the Germans speaking, the French speaking, the Americans speaking, all saying that they reaffirm the commitment to maintaining, upholding, protecting Ukraine's territorial integrity. Ukraine borders the European Union. 4 different EU states border Western Ukraine, so it's something that is very important for the EU to maintain territorial integrity. The possibilities for a refugee crisis, if there is an incursion by Russia into Ukraine, could send many people over the border into EU frontier states with Ukraine, like Poland and Hungary. So the idea for maintaining Ukraine's territorial integrity, trying to bring back this ceasefire in the east of Ukraine, along with the overall dialing down of tensions in the current crisis linked to Russia's build-up of more than 100,000 troops on the fringes of eastern Ukraine, mean that there are a lot of things at play. There was a lot in play before this current crisis, as you mentioned, with the eastern Ukraine and the conflict there. The Minsk agreements trying to bring an end to that conflict. So there is a lot at stake. President Macron here in France does believe, though, that there is at least a chance for continued dialogue. We may well see the foreign ministers of the US and Russia meeting this week, and we may well see, as you mentioned at the top, the presidents of the United States and Russia meeting, if there are conditions agreed to and if there are principles agreed to. So that is the next thing to look forward to, a potential dialing down of the tensions if the US and Russia will be meeting face to face.
Absolutely indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Ross Cullen, for joining us from Paris and getting us all those insights then. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.